I can take care of it all. All right, committee, welcome to committee. And just for FYI, this is basically for the public, to be informative to the public of kind of what the build process is going to look like. And at first, we'll start off with the revisor's office. I'm not sure if Jill do that. Just kind of explain the law of how that came, what the statute says, and how that was put together. And then we'll bring up the administration to talk about implementation. So welcome to committee, Jill.
Good morning, sir. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak with you briefly. Many of you will recall that in Senate Bill 25, there were the provisions that created the Build Kansas Advisory Committee and the Build Kansas Matching Grant Fund. And what this fund is it's housed in the state treasurer's office, and it's administered by them, and it's a no-limit fund. In FY24, $50 million is transferred from SGF, and then in 25, 26, and 27, $55 million is transferred. And I might point out that extra $5 million is for operating expenditures. It was our understanding during committee, and Representative Hoffman's very familiar with this, that the agencies had money, startup money, from a different pot of money, so they wouldn't need in 24, they wouldn't need that operating expenditure money to pay for grant experts in grant writing and other people who would bring expertise to it, consultants. But then in 25, 26, and 27, they would need that money for operating expenditure. So that's what that extra $5 million is from. The members of the committee are listed there, and obviously you guys are aware that you have been appointed. The bill specifically said that in FY24, a Senate person would be the chairperson and the vice chair would be from the House. And then that rotates in the ensuing years. The bill specifically says that the chair and vice chair will rotate. They are to meet, they're allowed, your committee is allowed to meet during session, because you know how sometimes we specifically say the legislature's in session, and so the committees don't need to meet, but this was an instance where we thought that the committee specifically needed to have the ability to meet during session, and so you do have that authority specifically in the law. And then also, there were going to, we wanted to recognize that there might be times where you had a needed to meet virtually, and which is very common now, as we all know. But we just wanted to recognize that there might be times when the committee needed to meet virtually. The next part of this memo, I'm really gonna more highlight, because the slides that the agency has really in-depthly goes into the process, because what happens is the state agencies are supposed to get out information to local communities on potential infrastructure projects, and their job is to inform and educate the local communities, and those state agencies will form a steering committee to work through that process. And the steering committee, after advising and consulting with you guys, will establish a means test. So I think that's one of the primary goals of today's meeting, is you guys reviewing and working with the agencies to determine a means test to determine whether the local community is eligible entity pursuant to the federal act and has demonstrated a need for the grant. So that's what you guys are looking at. And then the application requesting that will be approved by the coordinating state agency in consultation with the steering committee prior to submission to you guys. But all grant applications then will be submitted to your committee, the Build Kansas Advisory Committee, for you to review and consult on. One of the things that I really wanted to bring up to you is, say there's like this year, there's a fabulous project that somebody needs, or you know, maybe a handful of projects that need $80 million, and you only have $50 million. But as a committee, you think, you know, these are solid projects, are great projects, they need to be done. You have the ability to ask State Finance Council to increase that money. So in that scenario, you would have the ability to ask State Finance Council to transfer 30 million more into that, so you could cover that. Now, what that means then on the back end, in 27, you would only have 20 million for that final year, because as the program is currently established, only 215 million is transferred for this program. So you would just be asking the State Finance Council for the authority to be able to use that money earlier than you anticipated, because you have projects that you think are very solid projects and worthy, and you want to get them funded. So I just wanted to highlight that, that you have that ability. And then highlight also that projects that the bill anticipated that would be used for these matching grants are water, transportation, energy, cybersecurity, and broadband infrastructure projects. Now, it's not limited to those, but we wanted to highlight those, that those were the types of programs that we were looking to, and that's listed on page 2 there at the bottom of the 3rd paragraph. And then I had already talked about the $5 million. And then in 25, 26, and 27, the agencies can only use for that consulting and grant writers, they can only use $5 million for operating expenditures for that. So it is limited to that. So if you think about it, $200 million will be going out in matching grants to the communities. And so that 15 is for, operating expenditures of the state agency. You approve those funds, so they wouldn't have to spend, and the agency I'm sure can speak to that, but they wouldn't have to spend all of that, and they could spend more of that than on, maybe it only costs $2 million, and so you'd have an extra $3 million, but in the out years, you'll just have to work through that and see how that is working. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and there it's on the bottom of page 2, second to the last paragraph, the committee who worked on this was concerned that the grants be geographically distributed across the state, and so they specifically put in there that that they would be distributed, and they're based on the Department of Commerce's economic development districts. And then for the purposes of this program, the MOCAN district will be combined with those counties that are not associated with any Kansas Economic Development District. And I know there's a map. We saw the map, and I'm sure they can pop that up. I don't think it's in the slides today, but we can get it to you so everybody will know like what they are looking at. And then I did want to point out there on the page 3 in the second to the last paragraph, the goal is at least $10 million in each of those districts. So specifically in 26 and 27, eyes will be on that geographic map to be sure that at least $10 million is allocated to each district. So just to be sure that just to be sure, like those population hubs are not in the state are not getting all the money, that everybody else is able to share in this infrastructure building program. The other thing that I wanted to point out is there will be an annual report to the Senate Ways and Means Committee and the House Appropriations Committee, and it won't start until 25, so January of 25. You'll get a report, but it really gives the program 18 months or so to get started, and then all they'll tell you like all grants that have been approved that will show up in the annual report. This proviso specifically says that on September 30th, 2027, all reports should be given, all projects should be given out, and it should be dispersed, and then the fund actually is abolished on September 30th, 2027. So if there would be, I'm just going to say like $100,000 or something left in there, it would be transferred to the state general fund. I'd be pleased to stand for questions. I think a lot of the program details are in the slides that you're going to see, but I just wanted to hit some high points that were not in the slides, and I just wanted you to kind of have that in the back of your mind as you begin your work.
Thank you, Jill. And just real quickly, that EcoDevo map, I know we're supposed to have the materials from this meeting on the Treasurer's website available to people. I'd like to have that map distributed to the committee and included on the website. With that command, and Jill, I see you'll be available for questions even
Yes,
after
sir.
the
Yeah,
implementation. Is there any questions up front from the committee? Representative Waymaster.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let's just talk about fiscal year 2024, because we're going to have the outreach of going out to the communities on the application process. We could run into a situation where we don't expend the $50 million in fiscal year 2024. Does that carry over into the subsequent year of 2025?
Yeah, so this is a special revenue fund, and so those monies don't leave, so it doesn't have to be reappropriated because it's not a state general fund. It's a special revenue fund, so yes, those monies just stays in there, and then in September of 2027, if money's not spent, it transfers back to SGF. But yes, sir, yes, you wouldn't have to spend $50 million in 2024. You could carry it over. It would remain in the fund, excuse me, sir. It would remain in the fund.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Ms. Chair.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Jill.
Thank you, sir.
And we'll move on to presentation. I think Calvin's up to bat on this one. Will Secretary Reed, excuse me.
That's okay.
I apologize. Welcome to committee.
Yeah, Calvin Reed, Secretary of Transportation for Kansas, and I'm also the Infrastructure Coordinator for Kansas. So here to speak today about the Build Kansas Fund. Just really, this is meant for your guys' information, and then any feedback that you might have for us to take back. We are ready and raring to go to get an application out to our community so they can start applying for these funds. And what do I need to do to?
Pull the slides up.
All right, well, we'll get the slides up. This fund is really about addressing a couple things that we've heard when we've gone out and spoken to communities. When we've talked about the challenges with the bipartisan infrastructure law, IIJA, it's really about two things. One, most of these federal programs require some sort of local match or match for them, and communities just don't have the resources to be able to provide that match. And the other is that there is some sort of technical ability that it takes to be able to apply for these funds. And a lot of communities, especially our smaller communities, are lacking in those resources. So this was really a marriage of those two goals to try to give resources in terms of funding to be able to provide that match so that communities can meet their goals, meet their needs, but also to help provide those technical resources so that our communities can apply efficiently for these funds. And I'm still not seeing the slideshow, so there we go. All right. And so I think it's clearly demonstrated by this slide, right? The goal here is benefiting our Kansas communities. There are kind of three different pieces to this. There's the federal piece that, now all of a sudden with the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a lot more opportunities for our communities to take advantage of. But there's also their own resources. And now we have Build Kansas to help provide state resources. And it's really finding that sweet spot right in the center where we can marry those three and really bring the most benefit to our Kansas communities. So this is just a little bit of level setting here. This is our goal. This is what we're trying to accomplish, and this is what we hope to accomplish with this program. So I'm going to do just a little bit of recap. I know that we have a couple hours, but in speaking with President Masterson, I know he'd like to get out a little bit sooner. We'll take as much time, obviously, as you want, but I will go through this quickly. And I appreciate Ms. Walters going through. I think her recap was great, so I'll touch on some of the things that she said and expand on them. So we'll talk a little bit about the BIL and what is available now through the BIL. We'll talk about the Kansas Infrastructure Hub and what it has been doing. We'll also talk a little bit about Build Kansas and just kind of expand a little bit on what Ms. Walters said. And then we'll go through the application and the means test and hear your comments. So a little bit about BIL. Just a reminder, BIL is a huge federal program. It's actually many programs. There are 400 formula grant programs within BIL that are administered by 12 federal agencies. So it is very large, and it covers many sectors of infrastructure. It's not just transportation. It's not just broadband. It really covers almost anything related to infrastructure. BIL is really separated into two pots. The first pot we're not going to talk a lot about today is the formula pot. All right, and the formula pot represents about 60% of BIL funds. And really what that is money that has been apportioned to our state by the federal government by various formulas with each agency. If you add up on the right there and see all those formula funds that have been allocated by sector, those add up to $3.8 billion, with a large part of that being in transportation. Now, what I will say is BIL had two functions in transportation in terms of formula funds. It extended our previous formula amount and then added on $725 million. So we don't have $3.2 billion of new federal formula funds for transportation. We have about $725 million of new federal funds. So just want to make sure that's clear. And then the other 40% are these discretionary grants, where communities and states will be applying against other communities and states to help bring in more money to Kansas and help Kansas communities. These are not guaranteed dollars. These are competitive. And so that is why we are putting this program in place to give us a competitive advantage as a state to provide more benefit to our communities. Just real quick, BIL covers many things. I talked about it. It's many different sectors and infrastructure. It's also many different types of projects. So we have some listed there. It's anywhere from dams, taking care of lead pipes in our cities, electric charging stations, carbon capture, roads, bridges, but it also covers a wide variety of recipients. So it can be cities, it can be counties, it can be states, it can be, in some cases, it can be private, tribal governments. Just really, each program is going to have its own list of eligible recipients. So we need to be open to all of those recipients when we're looking at this program, making sure it gets executed to its highest potential. Now, the Kansas Infrastructure Hub. This is a group that was formed shortly after BIL was passed, and it's really a group of lead agencies that are really involved in infrastructure, and they're listed there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we call this the sub-cabinet. The Department of Transportation has been kind of the lead agency for this group since it was initiated, and really we are continuing on that role going forward. But beyond just the state agencies involved, there has been an advisory group also. And I think Representative Vaughn, you are part of that advisory group. So this advisory group has from the very beginning been trying to formulate and communicate with communities to understand really where the need is, where the gap is in terms of being able to utilize this funding. And so the advisory group and these cabinet agencies come together to form the Infrastructure Hub and have really advised this process from the beginning. Like I said, Ms. Walters gave a great recap of Build Kansas. I'm going to go in depth on a few terms that we have been wrestling with over the past few months. First of all, BIL, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Just so you all are aware, there are many different programs out there right now, federal legislation out there right now that address infrastructure. There's the Inflation Reduction Act and a couple others that I can't think of off the top of my head, but Build Kansas specifically speaks to BIL. And so this is what we are targeting because that is what the legislation allows us to go after. So we're talking about BIL funded projects only. Eligible entities, that is really any entity that BIL identifies as a potential applicant for these grants. The steering committee is really the infrastructure hub minus the advisory group. So it is that sub-cabinet of agencies that is really advising and reviewing these proposals, the technical expertise and the, the public service aspect of reviewing these applications. And then the advisory committee, which is you all, which is the legislative committee. So that is just some of the terms that are used in Build Kansas. Want to make sure we define them and that we're all on the same page on what those terms mean. Build Kansas, as I have said before, was designed to address those critical local needs to bring as much community benefit to Kansas communities as possible. It is a one-time investment, and Ms. Walters went over that very clearly. $215 million, 200 of which is for matching opportunities for our communities. The other $15 million is for administration, including hiring the needed consultants to be able to advise on grants and to be able to do the reporting and other reviewing process along the way. And it's really about a two-pronged approach. Like we said, there's the $200 million that is meeting local match requirements, and then the $5 million, a little expounding on that. We will help identify needs, find program and grant opportunities for communities. We also be able to communicate proactively to our communities about available grant opportunities. And then grant writing to an extent. I mean, I would want to be really cautious about this, how we communicate this. So I'll be very clear. To apply for all of these grants is a huge lift, takes a lot of resources. That was not envisioned in this $15 million. There will be some cases where we may be able to help really advise on the way to write grants, but we will not have the resources to write grants for all of these various applications. And then obviously the administration on the back end, tracking and making sure that our those federal dollars are being spent the way they were intended, and the state dollars also. And with the final goal of really leveraging state funds to capture as many federal dollars to Kansas communities as possible. So the way I would like to talk about this, and we talk about it as a leverage fund, 25% of local match could bring in 75% more federal dollars to Kansas. So to think about it in another way, I'm going to reverse what I said. Most of these federal grant opportunities require at least a 20 to 25% match, right? So this $200 million as being that match could bring in as much as $600 to $800 million more of federal money to help Kansas communities. So this is really a leverage rather than that $200 million just being distributed across the state, where maybe be able to multiply that into $800 million or $1 billion. So now we're going to get into the application and the process. So the guiding principles all along that we have established when we talk about the application is that we want it to be simple because a lot of our Kansas communities, like we said, their resources are spread very thin. We want it to be very easy to navigate, very easy to understand what we're asking for. So simplicity is number one. We want it to be available, these funds to be available to a wide group of audiences, to a wide group of eligible entities. It also, we're going to have to talk about flexibility, right? There's going to be a lot of things that, new rules are coming out almost on a daily basis with a lot of these federal discretionary grants. And so we need to have flexibility within our processes to be able to respond to what the new rules will be. And I think right now the legislation has given us a lot of flexibility. And then finally, it's obviously important anytime we're spending taxpayer dollars that we are accountable and transparent. And all of our processes should be accountable and transparent, not just to you, but to any Kansan who is interested in how this money is getting spent. So next, we're going to do a quick overview of the application. And Vanessa is going to pull it up on the screen. Members of the committee, you should have a copy of the application. I'd like to just walk through it really step by step. And while Vanessa pulls it up, you guys all have a copy of the application. We've gone through many iterations of this with the hub, and this is what we've landed on. And like I said, guiding principle here is simplicity. So the first part of the application process is really just basic information, that information that we will need in order to be able to track the application throughout its entire lifespan, right? From beginning to end. Okay. That's fine. We'll go ahead and keep going through, I think. So there's really nothing in that first part. Obviously, if you guys have any feedback about that, we would love to hear it. I don't think there's anything in there that's really too controversial. I think one thing that is important to discuss, items 9 and 10, there are situations where a community might ask for a large grant, and maybe we are not able to, as the Build Kansas Fund, be able to give that full amount. We need to understand if that's a deal killer. If that keeps the project from moving forward, we need to understand that, because that obviously needs to be part of our evaluation process. Another thing to consider here, though, is also that many times these federal grants are not, they do not award the full amount that is being asked. So we need to also understand if they are not able to move forward without the full Build Kansas, they may also not be able to move forward without the full federal grant. So we need to understand how sensitive they are to getting that full amount. And I think every community is going to be a little bit different. On the next page, the second part is the eligibility criteria. And this is really just some certifications from the applicant that they are eligible for these grants. Like I said, very simple. We're not asking for a lot of information here. You'll notice on question 4, we break it down by zip code. There's the opportunity for communities to come together and co-apply for grants. So understanding how those grants would get administered to different communities is important for us in the tracking process, and also understanding, when we talk about making sure that this money gets spread across the state to different communities, this will help us track that. Part 3 is probably what we would like to talk about the most, and that is the means test. This was a part of the legislation that a means test would be a part of the application process. And really, our interpretation of the intent of the means test was really to make sure that this money was getting sent to communities that otherwise would not have the means to be able to take advantage of these federal programs. It's not excluding. So I just want to be really clear. We are not excluding any communities from applying, but this is helping us understand whether or not a community has the means or not, and help us make that decision. So once again, simplicity, right? We really wanted to keep this simple. So it's really some certification statements, and I'm going to read them just so we all hear them, right? So the first certification statement: are there available funding sources currently planned to go unused that could be leveraged for this project? So just understanding whether or not they would have other funds available within their means to be able to use as part of the local match. And that's a yes or no question. The second, are there ARPA or coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars that could be used for this match? So once again, it's just trying to identify any other potential funding sources that they might have at their disposal. And that's a yes or no question. Have you explored other readily available resources, federal or non-federal, to be used for this match? Once again, just a yes or no question. And briefly describe your efforts to find other available funds for this project, limited to 500 words. So once again, this is not meant to exclude anybody from applying for these funds, but it really does make them answer those questions of whether or not they have exhausted all resources to go find other local or other funds available to be able to be a match for this. Yeah, Representative Hoffman. Oh, sorry.
You guys want to ask questions while the president? Go ahead, Representative Hoffman. I'd prefer at the end, but if there's something, I think it helps speed the process up.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
All right, and then in the fourth part, just some additional information that we would like for tracking purposes. And that is really the entire application. It's a 2-page application. We said simplicity is what we're going for here. We will be reviewing how this works through the first year, and there will be an opportunity maybe for a reset if we think that there's some part of the application process that is not working or needs a slight revisions. So that is the application itself. The next thing I'd like to get into is really just the process that we see going forward to help to make sure that communities can apply for these funds. So obviously application, we need that out there for them to start applying for these funds, but there are many entities involved with this process, and we want to make sure that we are clearly delineating the responsibilities of each group. And okay. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna work from here. You guys can see. Here's what I will do. I will be talking from this slide right here, a swim lane diagram. And really, it's identifying the folks that will be involved. So the different entities that we've involved, or that we know will be involved. Obviously, the local entity who will be applying. The infrastructure hub will have some involvement. The steering committee, the advisory committee, and then also the state treasurer. And I appreciate members of the state treasurer's office being here today. So the process that we have outlined is that the entity will apply for the funds. They will submit an application. That will be reviewed by the infrastructure hub for completeness, just to make sure that everything is in order before passing it to the next step, which is to the steering committee. And the steering committee will review that application and either approve or deny that application. Those approved and denied applications then will move on to the advisory committee, to you all, for your advisement on it. Once you guys provide your advisement, it will move to, you will then notify the state treasurer's office about a pre-obligation of that funding. And then the infrastructure hub at the same time will be advising and letting the local entity know that their application has been approved or denied. And then there's a pause. At that point, the local entity will either continue forward with their application, their federal application, with our certification that we have funding available or not, and then the federal agency will then be reviewing and doing the awards for those grants. So this is really important, maybe a good point to just stop and pause and remind everybody that when we commit funds for local communities or local entities to use, that does not guarantee a project. That just gives them makes it more likely that they would get a federal grant, right? But the federal agencies are still the ones who have to award the federal grants. So even if we commit funds, not all of those funds will get used because not all of those grants will get approved by federal agencies. So just making sure that we all understand that as we work through our processes, it might make a difference about our yeses and nos, right? Once the federal grant is awarded, we'll assume it's awarded, then it's a matter of distributing those funds, the Build Kansas funds, to the local entity in a way that makes sense for that particular grant application. So that's the high-level view of the process. So I see we still don't have it up, so I will talk from paper again. So we also wanted to look at it from the applicant's perspective. So you should have a slide that looks something like this. Next slide in the deck. So from the applicant's perspective, it's important to recognize that they are actually applying for two different grants, right? The first grant that they're applying for is the federal grant. They're going to be navigating through that process. And that can be anywhere from 60 to 90 days typically. The other grant that they would potentially be applying for is the Build Kansas grant. So we will need to make sure that we have the ability to respond quickly to communities to make sure that we're answering the question of whether or not they are eligible for and receive Build Kansas award so that they can put that into their federal grant. They will need that award done before they can complete their federal grant. So it absolutely needs to fit into that federal grant timeline. Then from their perspective, once the grants have been applied for, it's really just waiting for the federal agency to award the grant and then execute the grant after that. Now, we should probably talk about what happens if a federal grant is not awarded and they were awarded Build Kansas funds. At that point, our thought is that those funds would then be de-obligated from that community and put back into the Build Kansas pot for future applicants to be able to utilize. And there'll be a process associated with that also. How are we doing?
We're trying to get back online. We both got kicked out, so.
Okay.
We're going to be there shortly, hopefully.
All right, so the next group of slides really talk about what this looks like from an administrative perspective, and we'll just talk step by step. You know, first of all, from our perspective, we will be notifying communities when these notice of funding opportunities become available through the federal government. We will not be submitting applications on behalf of communities, so it will be on them to submit an application. We will not really be involved in this process until applications are submitted. Like I said earlier, the hub staff will perform a completeness review and the steering committee will make the ultimate decision. And that's really the technical expertise of those folks, those cabinet agencies, to be able to make a decision on whether or not, you know, technically that project is ready for delivery. They will pass on the yes or no, which will get passed on to the advisory committee. Advisory committee will advise and pass on to the state treasurer's office. I think the main thing to highlight here is that, yep, oh good, we're up. Yep. So those two slides talk about the process. I'll talk a little bit about what I think some of the gotchas are here. These applications are going to be coming in sporadically. You know, I think notice of funding opportunities come available. You know, I'll just talk about transportation sector. You know, at least once a month, we're getting new notices of funding opportunity from USDOT. I think probably similar if you start talking about broadband or energy or water, similar cadence. So we are getting these constantly. We will communicate these to our communities, you know, how quickly they can respond and put applications together. We're going to try to make this as efficient as possible and bundle as many of these as possible. But you know, really, for us to be successful, we're going to have to be pretty responsive from all parties, including this advisory committee, being responsive in terms of turning those around and getting them a decision. So, you know, right now we're envisioning from our standpoint, the infrastructure hub and the steering committee about a two-week cadence of reviewing and turning around these applications.
Did you have much more, Calvin? If not, I think we're far enough into the slide deck. I might go ahead and start opening up for questions.
I'm absolutely, that's really about it.
I would note, I believe we have Senator Clay's, and I saw Senator Reddy at least online. Not sure about Senator Schallenberger. So for those of you online, if you have a question, I can't see you, please just, I don't know, make a noise that's obvious to me. So, and we'll have your question. I would note, committee is, and this is intended also for your feedback. If you have feedback on anything that's beyond this committee meeting, like input on the means test, input on the application process, please reach out to our office if you have something after this, and we may decide whether or not we need to have a follow-up meeting on this for inputting with them. But other than that, this is intended to really get information into the public. So with that, I'll start opening up for questions. I know Representative Hoffman had one, so I'll just hop to you right now.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Going to the means test, is there a way that maybe we could add a couple more questions possibly that maybe deal more with their budget and then also with their need for the project? So how they have determined that this is a need for their community, and then also maybe what this application means as far as percentage of their budget. Because I think that kind of shows a little bit of how they would be able to possibly cover it if it's, depending on how much of their annual budget or their infrastructure budget or something like that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Representative Hoffman. And I will say we have wrestled with that same discussion. We've gone through numerous iterations of what these questions might look like, and we can absolutely revisit that. A couple of the issues that I'll say came up as we discussed this, I would say a budget doesn't always identify whether they have the means or not, right? Because cities with big budgets have big needs. Communities with smaller budgets, they may have smaller needs, but they're just as critical. So we really struggled whether or not the budget was the right metric for looking at. We can look at it again and absolutely report back to you.
Yeah, and maybe the budget's not the right, but just some sort of how this is impacting, and maybe you put it in there, would they be able to do it if they didn't?
Yeah.
I guess that is kind of in there.
That's, we tried to simplify this to really the simplest question that we could ask is, have you really investigated all the other possibilities, including your own budget, including other state funds, including other federal resources for filling this gap?
Okay. Well, I'd still like to see something that kind of gives a little bit more of an idea of how this is going to impact their community. Why is it needed? Maybe. And then the other question is on the grant writing. I understand that $5 million isn't going to go very far, but also there's a lot of communities that I'm not sure, especially the very small communities, I'm not sure they have the ability to hire a grant writer if they don't know that they're going to get the money. They're not going to put out quite a bit if they're not sure they're going to get it. So where do they fit in? What is your office going to be able to help them do?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. I should have mentioned it. So there are actually opportunities, and I'll just say like FHWA, USDOT have opened up grant writing opportunities for communities to apply for. I think it's our job to help identify potential sources for those grant writers, and if we absolutely need to, we will have the resources to write grants, but I would just be really, really careful not to commit to writing a lot of grants for a lot of communities. So it would have to be an exceptional circumstance.
Right, I understand. Yeah, you don't want to write them all, but I'm just trying to see do you have a means test yourself, I guess, to kind of say, okay, this is a situation where we are going to give that help.
I would say we'll have to take that back and look at it for sure. I know this is going to be a big issue. And like I said, we're going to have to be flexible with this. As we go through the process, we will identify things like that, how big of an issue that really is. And we'll, obviously, our job is to take hurdles out of the way of communities. So if it becomes a hurdle, we will be working to try to figure out a way to take that hurdle out of the way.
Okay, because I know that goes back to the budget. If they don't have the budget to even hire someone to do the grant, they're not going to apply for it.
Yeah.
And then just one last thing, and just food for thought as we look at it. We probably won't ever get into this situation, but there may be something we want to look at in the next few years after, if there's entities that have applied and not gotten the grant. So the money's, they've gone back, but if they maybe come back with a smaller need that maybe we just are able to help them with just the state build money.
Yeah. No,
And that's kind of outside of what this is, but it kind of comes back to, I hate for the bunch of money to be left at the end of the several years, and there be entities that maybe could have just used the state money to get where they needed to get in a smaller project.
yeah, Representative Hoffman, I really appreciate where you're going with this, because I think one thing that this will help us do is really quantify need across the state. Not just, we don't have any idea what every community's needs are. This will actually start giving us some metrics about what communities' needs are. And I think it will further conversations even beyond this about how do we address those needs and which needs really are we best suited to help address.
Yeah, and I would say 3 comments to your questions, Representative. 1, if you've got suggestions on means, a question you think is appropriate, please submit it, and we'll talk about that. 2, we're going to go through a couple sessions in the midst of this program, and so I'm sure your chairman, you're on appropriations, we may have conversations, because one thing popped in my head is this is so specific to Bill. Maybe we'd know there's some other program, maybe it needs to be expanded beyond just qualifying in that program, right? And you'd also have that opportunity to look at specific programs. But if you have any questions on, or you have specific thoughts about a question, please submit it, or adjustments to the application, and we'll decide whether or not we want to come back. We may be able to do some of that even offline and work that into the process. But I have another question. Next question up is Senator Reddy. I had a mark that you had a question.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have actually about 2 or 3 questions. The first one is the $5 million that's going to be for the hub staff and the consultant group. I wanted to know, when we talk about consultants, are they coming from these departments that are part of the hub, or are you having a bidding process? Who are these consultants that we're talking about?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So we have actually already hired a what I would call a program manager consultant to be able to help with this. We went through that process actually starting in about February of 2023 when we knew that there was the potential for this. We are using Spark dollars, a Spark award to the Kansas Department of Transportation to be able to fund the first year, which was a $3 million award. We went through a procurement process that the D of A was very visible to.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, you said once applications are there and the steering committee has a chance to look at them, there's usually a recommendation of support or denial. Do all of those applications, regardless of their status, come to the advisory committee?
That would be our intention, is that all applications, whether approved or denied, are visible to the advisory committee.
Okay, and from there we can also suggest, I know there's this hard timeline about 45 days, and I didn't want to have a back and forth on any one of them or anything of that sort. I wanted to know how that process would work. Once we receive them, is there a timeline that we have, 3 or 4 days, a week, or what it is, by the time we have to get back to making a decision, I suppose?
Yeah, we envision about a 2-week cadence on these. So every couple weeks, we would have some to put in front of you, and that you guys would be able to advise on. And so, I guess it would be our hope, just because of the quick turnarounds on a lot of these, that within a couple weeks they could be turned around.
Okay, and my last question, there was mention of regions where these come from. How do we make sure, as was alluded to by the representative before me, that we're not getting them all from the same big pockets of areas because they have the resources to apply for these grants, or they just have more area to cover, or whatever it might be? I'm sure we don't have a quota system for each of the regions, but how do you know you're being equitable throughout Kansas to make sure we are spreading out the resources?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I think that's one of the most important questions that we could all ask, right? Because some regions may be more proactive about applying for these. I think that's where the infrastructure hub team steps in. You know, we have an advisory group that is really composed of people from all across the state. We're going to have opportunities to do communication and outreach. And I think what we would do if we found some regions that were not submitting as many applications, we would do targeted outreach to make sure that they are aware of those applications. Now, at the end of the day, we cannot fill out the application for them. They need to fill out the application. It needs to meet their needs. So we would just be really working with those districts to make sure that they are aware of all the opportunities that are available to them.
And one final question. There's electric charging stations in here as one of the areas that the folks can apply for, communities can apply for. Do we have a state plan for electric charging machines within the state of Kansas? Because I would hate for it to be just put in here and there without us having an actual strategic plan on how we're going to move forward with this type of infrastructure.
Yeah, without getting into a lot of detail, we do have we call it our NEVI plan. It is mandated by federal government, by FHWA, and we have money allocated by the US DOT to administer to fulfill that plan. Any additional money that was made available through US DOT through discretionary grants would not necessarily have to fit within that plan.
All right.
Representative
Thank you. I
Helgers.
appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. A couple of follow-up on what Kyle and I were both looking at. You might put a clarification in, if the federal grant is not awarded, does the state share automatically go back to the pot of money, or does it stay there so they could resupply or resubmit the federal grant in an upcoming second year? You know, if you want to tell them that they have to start over, it's better to clarify that early.
Thank you for that comment.
I'm gonna follow up on a question and the discussion we had in Budget Committee, and actually it follows in with the electric charging stations and whether or not they're what entity. For the most part, we have talked about the idea of it going toward the locals, counties, cities, or whatever. I envision that there is going to be some for-profit corporations or companies, and there is one that I had been approached by earlier, electric charging stations that wanted to build electric charging stations. If they submit, or if a private entity submits a federal grant and they are awarded that grant, then we're providing the state matching funds, and this is going for the profits of a private entity. I want to make sure we all think about this ahead of time, because this is a little different than what the rest of the grant proposals are. And not that we have to come up with a decision today, but that's a whole different ballgame than what we were talking about earlier, okay?
Yeah.
And the final thing on the means testing. I really have some problems with the means testing. And I'll say that because they're so vague. If I looked at it and I said, well, how come the county didn't raise property taxes or raise taxes, or the city? Or did you apply for ARP and was it turned down? And have you applied for the additional funds of ARP that we will have this next year to deal with? You know, I think it's going to have to be a lot more specific if you and a committee are going to make some evaluations of that, or if we're supposed to look at it then, whether or not it's Kyle's idea or something else. I think it's going to be, you're going to need something much more specific. Maybe, you know, we do a cost benefit analysis. Maybe it's cost for the individuals that are going to be served.
I appreciate that feedback. And Representative Helgerson, I will say, we have discussed all of those scenarios. And I'll say to your question about money being available to private entities. We'll take that back and try to understand how that might impact our decisions here, and we'll get some feedback on that. But regarding, I think the way The way I would want to look at it is this. The success rate on these applications is probably no better than 1 in 5. So when you start thinking about, do we want to put a lot of barriers, a lot of hurdles in place for people to apply where they really probably have a 20% chance of getting awarded that federal grant at best anyway? I think our answer was we probably want to be yes before we say no. And so this was a very simple way to get to a yes. We can go back and look at some of the numerical metrics that we could look at. I will just say they're all very challenging because they don't necessarily always speak to a community's means. A big budget, like I said, cities with big budgets have big needs. And so we just have to think about that.
Representative, I'd also invite you to submit your ideas on means as well. I appreciate that.
Appreciate that too.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I had 2 questions. My first, since it's most likely guaranteed that not all of these applications will be approved by the federal government, is there a plan to over-obligate or front-load a lot of the local match dollars that we kind of make sure that a lot of that is approved initially, and then we can get a better idea over the course of the next couple of years, what funds we have remaining to actually apply towards local match?
The short answer is yes. We're going to have to over-obligate in order to be able to maximize the use of the money. So to what level we over-obligate, I think that there's going to have to be a little bit of a discussion there, and I think we will be better informed on that discussion after we go through the process a little bit down the road, right? How many applications do we get? How many of them are getting awarded? What's our success rate? Those are things that we're going to have to consider when we start talking about that number. But yes, I do think that is going to have to be part of the conversation, at least until we get to fiscal year 27. That's going to be a harder conversation there because there's nothing after that, right? Yeah.
And then my second question was in regards to the communication and outreach. I was just kind of interested to learn a little bit more about what your plan is to inform communities or local entities that they're eligible for these local match dollars. Is it going through the advisory hub? Because I know that's a combination of public-private entities, and they were kind of selected from across the state. Is it going that route, or what's your plan for education outreach on these dollars?
So right now it's very grassroots, and we are actually already doing that. We have members of our capacity extension team and members of the different sub-cabinet agencies that are attending events all across the state that deal with infrastructure and just talking about the hub. We're having booths at some of these places, some handouts, just so people are aware that this is coming. So, and I envision that is really going to be the best way to really communicate this, to attend, to go where the people are. So this winter, we are planning on going to the Kansas Association of Counties and League of Kansas Municipalities annual meetings, and we'll be talking to them. We've gone to the American Public Works Association meetings, and we've been talking with them. So it's really about just spreading the message far and wide and often.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Senator Clays, are you online? I had you up next.
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Reed, I have 2, I guess, questions / concerns, and I'll just share those with you. One is the level of sophistication of some of the proposals when we went through the Spark process on which I served. They varied widely. And so you had mentioned that there would be some level of assistance in the proposal process. Will that be prior to us seeing it, or will that be after someone is selected and it goes to the federal government?
Senator Clays, I think that's a good question. I would say it could be a mix, right? It just depends on the cadence of the federal NOFOs that are submitted and then how quickly the applications make it to us. But what I will say is, as I've said numerous times, our job is really to take the hurdles out of the way of communities. And I think we as the infrastructure hub will have a role in helping advise communities on what a successful proposal looks like.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I would just ask that there be some indication to us of those that received assistance in the assembly of the proposal that's before us. or I can just ask it every time, but it'd probably be easier just to mark them when someone has received assistance in that process and which ones have not. And some of that goes to my second sort of concern here, and that is the geographic distribution. During the Spark process, it was pretty evident that those that had a complete proposal that was more sophisticated were more likely to receive money, and those that did not were simply cast aside because they didn't have that kind of support. That essentially equates to big city versus small city, or township, whatever you want to call it. So I'd like to get to a level here where we're not excluding certain regions of the state, and that, you know, some of the concern that came out of both the Spark process and base 1 and 2 was the level of geographic distribution of some of these funds. I can't tell you how many times I heard things like, well, Western Kansas got the cheese factory or whatever. So it then ends up excluding 2/3 of the geographic portion of the state from any further funding in the minds of many people when something like that happens. And there are many deserving projects through that. I would be not excited about a process that left out many of the smaller cities in our state that have serious projects that can contribute to economic development in that area and the growth of those communities. So anything that you can do on the front end to assist us with having quality proposals from those individuals and seeking out some of the answers to questions you would anticipate would be extremely helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I echo everything you said, and I think the legislation is very smart in that we have set up these geographic regions and set targets for each of those geographic regions. That those targets account for, you know, that's 8 regions at $10 million per region. That's 80 million of the 200. So, you know, we're going to have very clear targets for each region, but we're going to have flexibility with that other 120 million. And I think what the message I heard very clearly is that we as the hub need to be making sure that we're helping coach our communities on what successful proposals look like.
We're going to move to Representative Waymaster.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. First, kind of going back to Representative Vaughn's question in regards to the outreach to the communities. I just want to make sure that all communities are going to be aware that this is available to them, because you're going to have smaller communities that may not be attending some of these functions that you had mentioned earlier, who have dire needs that need to be addressed. And so I just want to make sure that we're reaching out to the economic development directors of every county, county commissioners, everything. So they're aware of it, because we have very small communities across the state of Kansas that could benefit from this as well. Going back to Senator Clay's question, which is, you have the opportunity of probably getting the same question asked by me in 1 week's time in regards to the rolling pipeline with the Ike Transportation Plan. And I expressed my concerns of when that was introduced, and obviously in some of the information that you provided us last week, my reservations were actually found to be true, because more money had been going towards the more populated sectors of the state and not the more rural. So going back to Senator Clay's question, there are 6 or 8 different districts, because we got the map.
So,
and it says 6.
So I was just handed this. I apologize. I didn't mean to cut you off. This is actually KDOT district map. This is not the economic district map that corresponds with this legislation. So don't disregard this. We will get you. We will get you the right
data map. Okay, because we were going by that. And when you said 8, I was like, well,
yep.
6 here.
Yep.
But I would say, as your position as Secretary of Transportation, you could actually use this map that was supplied to us in making sure that all the different sectors of the state of Kansas for transportation needs in any ways is actually having applications sent in that can either be taken from the Ike Transportation Plan or other federal funding that we received. And so I think under your purview, you kind of have a little bit of a heads up on what's going to be happening. So that follows into my next question. How are we going to deal with the overlapping of federal funds? I mean, we have money coming in for broadband. We have money coming in. I mean, we just announcement of $45 million for bridges. You might have communities who might be looking at both programs. How are we going to manage an overlapping of applications to access those funds?
It's a good question. I would say not easily. And I think that's something that we're going to have to manage. And I think the different agencies are going to have to manage. It's really about communication. We need to understand when a community applies for funds, federal funds, this will help us actually see that more visibly. Right now, communities can go and apply for these funds, and they often do, and agencies don't have visibility into it until after it happens. So this will actually help us, I think, in that communication process, because we can see these applications, we can see these needs being expressed for these federal funds a lot sooner in the process. And to your point, from a transportation standpoint, yeah, I'm looking to take advantage of this because it will give us a much broader perspective of what the real needs are across the state and how we can address them. And now we have different options. Sometimes it can be pulled from one of our programs out of Ike, or sometimes maybe this is really better suited.
Okay, and I figured you'd probably have that same answer. Going back to the outreach, has any community or county or entity expressed interest since this went into effect July 1st? I'm saying
yes. There's been a lot of interest. Like I said, we've been going out and we've been speaking to some of these economic development districts. We've been speaking to regional meetings. Yes, absolutely. People are interested. People are they're waiting for this to come out so they can see what it's going to look like.
And then I think you answered this, but just to clarify, if a community or entity is declined or denied, will they be explained as to the reasons why?
It would be foolish not to. Okay. So, yes.
I didn't know if you said that in your previous answer or not. Now I'm going to take off my rural hat and I'm going to look at the state of Kansas as a whole. This was actually talked about last year with the Legislative Budget Committee, and we actually had a recommendation that was made to the Department of Transportation, and there was this joint effort with the cities of Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri, in expanding the streetcar line from Kansas City, Missouri, specifically to the University of Kansas Health Systems on the Kansas side. So if we have an application where we have, the reason why I say that is because on the application, it has, for example, Kansas and Missouri, and that's what triggered this question. How are we going to partner the city of Kansas City? Because, let me say, how are we going to partner with the Kansas City, Kansas, and then Kansas City, Missouri, in a joint application with two different states with different pots of money, but at the same time, if there is a joint effort, not only by two cities, but two states, in a particular infrastructure movement or project, that's kind of look more favorable with the federal government. So how are we going to work through that, I guess is my main question.
Yeah.
Working with either the city of Kansas City, Missouri, or the state of Missouri.
Yeah, I appreciate
a project like that.
Yeah, I appreciate your question. And this was envisioned as we put together this application, as you can see. I think, I'll just speak broadly. I think the challenge is going to be making sure that defending to Kansas taxpayers why we would support a project that could potentially benefit Missouri taxpayers also. And we also need to be able to understand, and really the locals need to help feed this information. We need to understand that Missouri taxpayers are also paying their fair share into that. So without that information, that may be a place where we would consider a no, right? I'm not speaking for the group here, but I mean, that would give me pause. Now, to your specific example, I'm not sure you're aware, but KCK and KCMO both submitted a joint raise grant for a planning effort for that, and they were awarded that raise grant. And so they are moving forward with the next phases of planning for what you're talking about, the east-west streetcar.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So again, I want to think about how I can help my communities be prepared for this, because I think there's some pretty definite timelines. If I remember right, sometimes these grant announcements come and then they've got 90 days.
Typically 90 days.
So they really need to be doing some front-end planning to be prepared. You know, I think about rail separations, you know, maybe somebody is wanting an overpass or something. What level, for them to have a successful application to the federal government, what kind of pre-engineering should they be working towards now? And how do they know what kind of grants might be coming forward in the future? I believe the last road or rail separation grant was last September. You know, do we have any visibility about what programs may be let on an annual basis so they can get some pre-engineering done?
Yeah, I mean, I could speak really broadly towards transportation, but the other sectors, I think there are other people in the audience who could speak better to that. But I think just very generally, we don't see new programs coming out. So what we have seen the first couple of years is what we will see, I think, in the coming years. Now, the cadence that the federal government has been putting these out has been a little bit different. They're resource strapped just like everybody else in terms of turning these things around. So we have some visibility, but not a lot. I think the key part of that question is what needs to be done in order to have a community be ready for success. I think the further along they are in the planning and the engineering process for any of these, the better. Obviously, if they're shovel ready, that's great. And I think that puts them ahead of most applications out there. That requires a commitment, right? There is a commitment to plan and to engineer. And I know that might be a challenge for some communities. We will have to work through that process with a lot of these communities of what does it take to get that really ready.
All right, thank you. Calvin, I had a couple myself. I see what the committee asked before I get to it. A couple things I didn't hear. As we're doing the distribution, equitable distribution amongst the districts, did we define what that meant? Because obviously, I haven't seen the districts, so I don't know. Some are gonna be more highly populated than others. What does this committee generally determine to be equitable distribution? Is it based on population, or what's the process for that?
Yeah, so what we just used the Department of Commerce's Economic Development District map, and that was the basis for the discussions. It's not by population, I don't believe.
Well, I think what I'm trying to figure out is, since I haven't seen the map, I'm not sure, but I'm assuming that map has districts that are more highly populated than others, and so is it meant to put an equal amount of money in each district, or is it really based on?
It's $10 million for each district is what is set in the legislation. And so each district will have a different population.
Regardless of population.
Regardless of population.
Okay. Then my second one was on the cost of the hub. I think Representative Hoffman touched on it, the $5 million for administration, but the hub, has agency personnel in it. Does the agency, just from an appropriation standpoint, is the agency funding or taking portions of salaries or determining who's accountable for how that $5 million gets distributed, since you have current employment sitting on there? Is that attributed to the agency, or is the agency drawing from the $5 million to recover itself in some way? Or, so I know this is kind of a small potato, but I'm kind of curious who's holding that accountable.
Yeah, so right now it's envisioned that hub sub-agency, whatever you say, will be housed within KDOT. We will be tracking the hours and efforts of hub personnel separately from KDOT personnel.
Are there specific hub, 100% designated to the hub employees?
Right now, we do not have that. We actually are in the process of getting the first position out there to really be the leader for the hub, an executive director for this. They will be a 100% dedicated hub employee.
So from the administration's perspective, are they going to start pulling employees from each of those agencies and start attributing that to the hub?
We have not had that conversation yet.
I'd just be interested in where that heads at some point. And then the third question, I noticed just in one of the scenarios, there was like the expedited scenario, 2 business days for the committee to, I mean, before any of that formalizes, I assume, right? I mean, it's not going to be the intention of Hub to say, this is an expedited application, therefore, if you don't hear from us in 48 hours, it's deemed approved and moved on. That, I want to make sure we have that consideration in place. That's not something that's been.
We have not discussed that. I would be hesitant to make the decision of passing it on without your guys' final say before you guys had the opportunity to weigh in on that.
I do agree we need to have some type of expedited process for unique situations. Committee, that was my last one on the list. So if there's any final questions, but also I'd remind people there's going to be access to this material online with the correct map, I'm assuming. We will be
Senator Masterson, our
all right, we're up.
map is up. So those are the.
Well,
There it is.
well, so that map will be available online. Representatives that have proposals or submittals, please submit and we'll decide whether we need to meet again. I think we have a final question here to Representative Waymaster.
And I would just kind of echo the comments of the chairman in regards to the expedited timeframe. We knew that was going to be the case when we were formalizing this process. And we knew that if we were possibly members on this committee, that it may be a short time frame where we may have to meet to approve. So yeah, even if it's 48 hours, I would think we would need to have some type of meeting, whether by Zoom or in person, to go through that application, because that was the whole purpose of setting up this committee, to review those. And then if you just don't happen to answer, it's approved. That's not the intent of what the legislature was in.
I mean, I think the process is pretty clear that it does not pass to the state treasurer's office without going through you guys. So. Yeah.
My last question has to do on the slides. Everything is pretty much self-explanatory, but if we're going to go out and talk to our communities about this program, do we have a definition of resilience? What would qualify into that?
Yeah, I think that's going to vary by sector, right? But resilience, I'll just speak generally from an engineering standpoint. Resilience is the ability to withstand any potential issue and not have a complete system failure, right? So if you think about, your roadway system, right? Getting into a city, if you have a major flood come through and you have one real access point to that city that has to cross over a critical bridge, and if that bridge gets flooded and taken out, then there's no longer access. That's a complete system failure for that city, for that community.
Okay, I think we might need to have more elaboration on that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
honestly, Representative had a similar question as regards to resilience, and I think I even mentioned there was a fire station. Some poor community couldn't even afford the fire station, and that, to me, would fit in a resilience kind of category, but that's something we probably need to explore. Senator Reddy, I was alerted, did you have one final question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think on one of the documents or the PowerPoint, it showed that communities don't even have to go through this process because this is a process for the $215 million. They can go straight to the federal level. Do we get an idea when somebody's been granted from federal funds? I know they may not be applying to these funds, but we also want to make sure as far as regional and get a comprehensive idea about who's getting the bill funds and who's not, regardless of whether they go through this process or an entirely different process on their own.
So yes, all of the awards from the federal government are made publicly available, and we will be tracking those.
Okay, thank you.
And normally, for when I run a committee, when I say final question, it's the final question. So this is the final question, Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for making an exception. I wanted to kind of briefly ask about next steps. So are we just waiting for this application to be approved in order for this to go live? When will communities be able to start applying for these funds? Do you have to wait till the ED is hired? Just what are the next steps in this?
We will be ready to, fire really, starting next week. Yeah.
That's a great question. Thank you, Secretary, for being here and being available again. Any submittal from the committee to us, and we'll determine whether or not we need to meet again anytime in the near future, but thank you for that, and we are adjourned.
All right, thank you.